Nice to see. Good morning. My name is Atman Trivedi. I'm the South Asia practice lead and partner at Albright Stonebridge Group, part of Denton's Global Advisors, affiliated with the Atlantic Council South Asia Center and the Pacific Forum. A big thank you to George Washington's Elliott School of International Affairs for organizing this unique and important conference today. We're off to a fantastic start. This next session is on India's trade policy and the global environment. And we have an all-star pair of speakers this morning. Today's presenter from afar is my friend and mentor, Arun Kumar. Arun divides his time between Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., and Bangalore, and now is the managing partner at Celesta Capital. He was the former chairman and CEO of KPMG India. Arun served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets. We worked together on policy initiatives and dialogues related to India at the beginning of Prime Minister Modi's first term. Last year, Arun authored an excellent book on international business called The Global Trade Paradigm. And in his spare time, he's also written 2 poetry books. Judith Dean, sitting here with us today, will be our distinguished discussant. Judy is professor of international economics at Brandeis University and is currently a visiting scholar at George Washington. Her research focuses on international trade and economic development and their effects on the environment. Judy's new work on India explores the impact of trade liberalization on Indian poverty. Our convener today, Ajay Chibber, asked us to consider India's trade policy with the following question in mind. For those of you who just joined us, what's it going to take to make India an advanced economy in 2047? So India's government seems to believe economic success is predicated on its ability to grow its share of world exports. In 1990, India's share of global exports stood at 0.5%. In 2022, it had increased 500% to 2.5%. And in 2030, that global share of exports is expected to be around 4%. But as we've heard about earlier today, India is attempting to accelerate its export of goods and services in the face of stiff headwinds around the world. And if we look inside India, a number of influential voices want to protect the economy from overseas imports, complicating the task of securing a larger slice of the global trade pie. So while India's potential and opportunities are enormous, the trade challenges facing India are not insignificant. With that, let me turn it over to Arun first to talk about India's trade policy and the present global environment. Arun?
Okay. Atman, great to be with you and with Judy today. I wish I could have been there in person at this wonderful gathering and also enjoy, as Ajay said, the best view in DC. Ajay, thank you for inviting me, and I note your courage in including me, not an economist like the distinguished presenters in the earlier sessions, to speak here. The topic for the session, as Atman said, is India's trade policy and the global environment. So let me start with the global environment, particularly the political context. Geopolitics today affects trade with more immediacy than we have seen in some decades. Let me highlight 4 features. First, the nature of global trade has changed, such that it is today by global supply chains by up to 70% of all trade. These supply chains form a network of interdependence that is susceptible to disruptions and vulnerable to points of failure. We have witnessed many such examples of disruptions. The war in Ukraine has disrupted supply chains that include rare minerals, commodity markets, and logistics networks. The World Bank estimates that the Ukraine war will cause world trade to drop by 1%, which will in turn lower global GDP by 0.7%, and in fact, the GDP of low-income countries by 1%. The Israel-Gaza situation has affected critical maritime pathways like the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, apart from Israel's important role in the global semiconductor industry. And of course, the tensions in the Middle East have implications on the price of oil. The China-Taiwan dynamic is a worrisome overhang on the world's supply of the most critical semiconductor products. Second, over the last 10 years, we have seen domestic politics around the world driving a rising protectionist trend. Starting with the Brexit vote in the UK and then the Trump presidency, policymakers and leaders in government and business began to rethink several facets of economic orientation. Around the world, we see more of a my country first philosophy. Countries such as India and China, which have been increasingly opening up to the world, particularly China, has been doing so for several decades, are now following suit and are turning inward. Bidenomics, characterized by the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, does not shy away from what would have been considered protectionism in the past or considered market distorting industrial policy. Third, the trade landscape must contend with the ongoing US-China discord and global concerns about China's ambitions. With over 25% of global manufacturing coming from China and most critical value chains intertwined with China, a key issue that has emerged is that of concentration risk. This drives a need for redundant sources of supply, what is now called supply chain resilience. The concentration risk came into sharp focus during the COVID pandemic, when Chinese manufacturers made 40% of all active pharmaceutical ingredients, the vital components of medicines, and 42% of all personal protective equipment. Now, from India's vantage point, the China situation could present an opportunity, in fact, presents an opportunity to be an alternative or additional node in global supply chains, supplanting or supplementing China. The focus on supply chain resilience is driving onshoring or nearshoring of value chains. A concept that gained currency is friendshoring, reshaping of global networks to include geopolitically closer countries. In fact, a recent IMF paper looks at trade and investment realignment along geopolitical lines since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They note significant declines in trade and FDI flows between countries in geopolitically distant blocs. They also note a set of non-aligned connector countries gaining importance as a bridge between blocs. Trust is a key element in friendshoring, and India is seen in many quarters as a trusted location and therefore can potentially be a connector country. Fourth, we are seeing the rise of regional multilateral agreements and other frameworks. Regional integration spanning large areas is strengthening. These structures are valuable for the efficiency of supply chains. In North America, for example, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement has done well. In Asia, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, that covers 10 ASEAN member states and their free trade agreement partners, Australia, China, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, has emerged as the world's largest trading bloc. With 15 member countries, it is now 2 years old. The RCEP embraces 30% of global GDP and 30% of the world's population. Its stated goals are to promote economic integration, trade liberalization, and cooperation among member nations. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, a free trade agreement between 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific, came into effect at the end of 2018. This was the Trans-Pacific Partnership without the United States. Now, India is in neither of these major regional free trade agreements. Now, this posture will handicap India in participating fully in many supply chains. While RCEP may be unpalatable to India for domestic political or perceived security reasons on account of China's dominance in the agreement, the CPTPP could well be one for India to consider. The CPTPP is an Indo-Pacific treaty, although it is interesting to note that even the UK has applied to join it, and indeed so has China. While staying out of these regional FTAs, India has been embracing and is key to several other multilateral frameworks, mostly focused on the Indo-Pacific. The most important of these is the Quad, made up of the US, Japan, Australia, and India. While the Quad was initially security-oriented, there is an increasing move and substantial potential to build out the economic dimension of the Quad. It has been estimated that if the Quad countries were to sign a trade agreement where bilateral tariffs are scrapped, India's real GDP would increase by 0.2% or $2.7 billion a year, while exports could rise by 2.5% or $5.7 billion. A potentially important development has been the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework by President Biden in Tokyo in May 2022 on the sidelines of a Quad summit. The IPEF has the participation of 14 countries, which is an expansion beyond the Quad. The IPEF posits an alternative framework for economic engagement, different from a free trade agreement. The IPEF has 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization and infrastructure, tax and anti-corruption. It also aims to advance capacity building in a range of areas, including the digital economy and cybersecurity. India became central to another framework, I2U2, made up of India, Israel, US, and the United Arab Emirates. The I2U2 is worth noting as another example of US-India cooperation. This unique grouping identifies bankable projects with a particular focus on joint investments and new initiatives in water, energy, transportation, space, health, food security, and technology. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC, aims to increase economic development by promoting connectivity and integration between Europe, Asia, and the Persian Gulf. The IMEC was announced at the G20 meeting in New Delhi in October last year. The IMEC will consist of 2 separate corridors, India to the Gulf and the Gulf to Europe. The countries that will be involved in the IMEC are India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Greece, Italy, and France. Now, some of these agreements in the Middle East will obviously be on pause given the current situation there. The Quad, IPEF, I2U2, and IMEC can be seen as a new trend, lattice works of multilateral frameworks where India is among the central players. Another important development to note is the rising conviction that technology will play a defining role in deepening the US-India partnership. The initiative on critical and emerging technology, launched in January 2023, aims to foster an open, accessible, and secure technology ecosystem between the US and India. Let me now look at the situation in India today regarding trade agreements, incentives, and tariffs. India has historically harbored hesitations towards a strong embrace of globalization and trade agreements. Of late, we may be seeing a change in this area. Interestingly, India has been one of the earliest members of global trade bodies. It was the signatory to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs at the commencement in 1948 and the World Trade Organization since its inception in 1995. But India did not extract the full benefits of such engagement. Just look at China. China had begun opening its economy around 1978. Starting in 1986, China lobbied hard for several years to become a member of the WTO, succeeding in 2002. A mere decade later, China had become the world's factory. Over time, Chinese companies emerged as competitors to their global counterparts, going on to dominate several sectors and acquiring global giants. India's economic reforms and opening in 1991 were not quite followed by the dynamism that China exhibited in its global integration in the trade arena. Very recently, India has signaled an openness to trade agreements. Thus, agreements have been concluded with Australia, the UAE, and more recently with the European Free Trade Association bloc, which is made up of Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. According to the Indian government, these 3 FTAs will result in boosting exports by over $100 billion while creating over 2 million jobs in India. An interesting aspect of the deal with the EFTA is that it includes a commitment of investment of $100 billion into India over the next 15 years. India's FTA with the UK is apparently in the final stages of negotiation, and an India-EU FTA has been under negotiation for over 2 years now. Let me move on to incentives to promote exports that Ajay had referred to earlier. Soon after being elected to office in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched an ambitious Make in India initiative. It aimed to increase the manufacturing sector to grow to 25% of GDP and create millions of jobs. Make in India did not make as much progress as desired on account of a combination of factors, both internal and external. More recently, manufacturing in India is seeing tailwinds on account of global corporations seeking to reduce their reliance on supply chains involving China, as well as by an increasingly capable and confident Indian manufacturing sector. To provide a fillip to Make in India and to help reap the benefits of these tailwinds, the Modi government launched the Production-Linked Incentives Program in 2020. The scheme has a budgeted allocation of $750 million for this current fiscal year, which is a 33% increase of the prior year. The stated purpose of these schemes is to enhance investments in key sectors and cutting-edge technology, ensure efficiency, and bring economies of size and scale in the manufacturing sector in India, and make manufacturing in India globally competitive. The scheme has been applied to 14 targeted sectors. Alongside, India has been increasing tariffs for various product categories with the aim of protecting domestic suppliers. Over the last 3 years, some 30 categories have seen increases, covering a wide range: solar inverters, solar lanterns, headphones, loudspeakers, smart meters, plastic goods, paper, vitamins, and so forth. The government of India sprang a surprise by introducing tariffs on personal computers and other electronic products in late 2023. These were withdrawn fairly quickly based on opposition from industry, both domestic and foreign. The motivation behind some of these tariffs seems to be to protect Indian industry from Chinese manufacturers. The move to use tariffs to protect domestic manufacturers is a throwback to the pre-1991 situation, when a result of such protection and internal licensing was that Indian products were generally not competitive internationally. Let me conclude with 3 main points. 1, India is a beneficiary of globalization, and this was mentioned by previous speakers. Its economic prosperity will be driven by its global interdependence and increasing trade and investments into and from India, helping drive job creation, GDP growth, and prosperity. 2, today the global supply chain situation works in India's favor for increased participation in manufacturing. A continued focus on the ease of doing business, ease of trade facilitation, creation of modern infrastructure, and associated logistics are required to facilitate greater participation in global value chains. 3, as India becomes the 3rd largest economy in nominal GDP, but more importantly, as the Indian middle class, currently estimated at 475 to 500 million, grows to become larger and with higher incomes, it will emerge as a significant market for US and global businesses. So I believe that we live in an age of mutual economic interdependence. Exports and trade are important to India's prosperity, and I hope India's policies will take advantage of these opportunities and the opportunities that such global integration offers to the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. Some important messages there. Next, we'll turn to Judy for her response.
It's a pleasure to be here today, and especially to be able to discuss the wonderful remarks of Arun Kumar. It's always a challenge when you find that you're discussing remarks where you wholeheartedly agree with most of the points made by the speaker. So what I hope to do is add some additional layer of maybe insight and questions and throw in a few provocative ideas and see what you think. So just to summarize, I'm gonna have to turn this around so I can view the slides and you. Let's move it over here. Arun just gave us really 3 important conclusions about the situation of, or India's situation in international trade today. First of all, that India has been indeed a beneficiary of globalization. Secondly, that the current concerns about global supply chain resilience actually gives India an opportunity to increase its role in global supply chain manufacturing. And thirdly, that India is poised to become a significant market for the US and a significant supplier to the world. He's also suggested that in order to embrace these opportunities, India should focus on a few things. First, promoting ease of doing business and better trade facilitation, creating a modern infrastructure and improving logistics so that India would be better able to participate in global supply chains. And finally, potentially really continue its current endeavor at participating in regional or global integration through trade agreements. Now, I'm going to say I agree. I agree. However, to do this, India's policies will really have to change. And since Arun has covered such a large scope of ground, I'm going to focus particularly on global supply chains. This comes partly out of much research I've done on Chinese global supply chains, so I'm going to take some lessons from what I've learned from studying that. First of all, I hope you can see this. This is a graph of foreign value-added content in India's gross exports, which is one of the standard ways of thinking about backward participation in global supply chains. So basically looking at the foreign content of what India exports to the rest of the world. The black line on the graph is India's share of foreign value-added in its exports. You can see that, thank you. Oh, you can see that from early on, mid-90s until 2012, you actually see some fairly steady growth in backward participation in India's supply chain, in global supply chains by India. In fact, the red line, which represents the OECD average, you can see a movement where India is coming closer and closer to the OECD average. However, after 2012, a big downturn. And that continues even at the outset of the US-China trade war. So as you see the tail end of the graph, 2012 onwards, the participation is falling and that convergence with the OECD average is disappearing. So I'm going to suggest a few changes to what India is doing, which I think will actually promote the ability of India to participate more in global value chains. The first would be lowering trade barriers. This is a huge effort that China did when it started in this process. Currently, as Arun said, India's been increasing tariffs, increasing protection, which is, as he put it, almost a throwback to pre-1991 policies. That's exactly what you do not want to do if you want to increase your participation in global supply chains. What it does is it impedes access to imported intermediates it also compounds the cost of production throughout the value chain as each time you import, as each time imported intermediates cross borders to reach India, we're going to have continual tariffs applied to those. So that's a bad idea. Secondly, it's my strong feeling that the Make in India and the production-linked incentives programs, which Arun described, are really working against GSC participation. For one thing, the emphasis is on self-reliance. And that's the wrong message if what you're trying to do is promote joint global production through a global value chain. A lead firm is not going to be attracted by the idea that you're trying to go it alone. That's not the whole philosophy behind a chain. Secondly, you have a real emphasis, it seems, on governments choosing winners. That's clearly what the US has been doing in the CHIPS Act, for example. So India is not alone in this, but again, if you really are seeking to increase your global participation in supply chains, this is not the way to go. In particular, it ignores comparative advantage, which was alluded to by our prior speakers in thinking about the relative abundance of workers in India and how to take advantage of that. This kind of an approach is unlikely to do that. Secondly, reducing domestic impediments. You might not have thought of this one, but China spent all the time thinking about this. I'll ignore whatever that was. Okay, so just a few notes. You've heard a lot about China +1 here in this discussion, and there is some evidence that overall, say India's share of US imports has grown a little bit since the China trade war, but it's only a small amount and not necessarily GSC trade. It's also driven by the trade war. What you want is to promote create an atmosphere in India's economy where global value chains will be attracted to India for its own economic characteristics, not because it's being driven by a trade war. In particular, there's a recent study by Van Limput that actually finds that domestic trade barriers or domestic trade between Indian states is actually impeded by a lot of things. They suggest things like burdensome tax administration, high tax rates, levels of corruption that actually impede states from trading with each other. That's going to be a roadblock for companies that want to come in and actually operate with global value chains. Finally, long-term relationships that are critical for global supply chain participation require things like strong property rights, trust, improved business. Require things like strong property rights, trust, improved business. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, but there's nothing I can do about that. Hopefully somebody back there knows what to do. Okay. In addition, availability of a skilled workforce and abundance of domestic suppliers. These are all critical things that you want to have to foster an environment where global supply chain participation can thrive. So actually paying attention to potential domestic impediments to global supply chain trade is important. And then finally, not quite finally, increasing FDI access. This was a critical feature of China's strategy. Just on the side here, you can see some data from India, which shows FDI inflows, the pie chart in 2019, 2020, so just before COVID. And you can see that 5 or 6 countries take more than 85% of the FDI. That's where it goes. So this is very unequally located across India. FDI is concentrating in various places. It's also concentrated across industries. That's the lower little chart here. That's showing the FDI equity inflows from 2000 to 2020. And what you see is, what I hope you see, is that most of it, 46% of it, is within 5 sectors. So you want to improve infrastructure and logistics, as Arun said, to attract FDI. You can also have incentives. China did have incentives for FDI, but it's been shown that they're not as important really as having a market-friendly environment where companies feel that they can thrive. Finally, if I have another 1 minute, do I have a minute? Okay. A note on regional integration, which played a big role in Arun's remarks. Let me first say why joining RCEP or CPTPP might be helpful to promote actually global supply chain participation. Number one, those are large trade agreements, both in terms of products and regions and country coverage. So they have the potential to create more trade benefits, so if through trade creation, and reduce the costs which come alongside with such a regional agreement, trade diversion costs. So potentially having a more likelihood of net benefits. That could stimulate FDI inflows. It could also facilitate India's government being able to reduce and keep down trade barriers because they would be part of such an agreement. And finally, it could potentially give the government of India incentives to stimulate it to move away from sort of the picking winners strategy and move more towards perhaps focusing on improving the domestic and economic environment in which to foster this kind of global supply chain participation. The graph on the right is an interesting chart by some of my colleagues at Brandeis, actually. And it shows some simulation model results of what would happen. First of all, on the graph A is what would happen if you had no trade war at all, and then you looked at the benefits of CPTPP, RCEP, so adding RCEP into the mix, and then you added India. And you can see on the chart that the benefits from, this is a global income effects from such an agreement in stages, continue to rise. But what caught my attention was that India is not there. If it joined, it would actually magnify the global income effects in a positive direction. What's interesting about the graph B is that you start with a trade war. So the second thing these authors do is say, let's build in the trade war. And you can see actually that light blue bar means that you start with a loss, a big loss. And now they build in what happens if we have CPTPP, what happens if we then add RCEP, and finally, what happens if India joins. And interestingly, once again, you see a big benefit there, which is more critically important, I think, in graph B, because you see that it actually helps you keep above that zero line because you started with a loss. So that $53 billion of extra global benefit actually is really helping you maintain a positive economic effect globally in the midst of a continued trade war. So perhaps adding a little bit of emphasis to Arun's considerations about the joining of trade agreements by India. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Judy, for those candid remarks. Arun, would you like 2 minutes to reply to Judy, or should we just go straight into the questions?
Yeah, I wouldn't take 2 seconds. I totally agree with everything Judy said. And I would highlight one point, that's that joining these free trade agreements can actually force a lot of liberalization in the country, which is a point she made in her last slide. And I think that's a really important one to keep in mind. So let's move on to...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, so let's move on to comments, questions. Yeah.
Thanks. While the audience gets their questions ready for both our speakers, I'll start us off with 1 or 2 of my own. The first is India's FTA offensive that Arun refers to in his remarks. Like the US, India isn't so keen on multilateral trade pacts. But unlike the US, it has recently displayed an openness a noticeable openness to negotiating bilateral free trade agreements. India's signed FTAs with Australia, the UAE, and most recently, 4 non-EU countries over the last couple of years. Reports suggest that India is getting closer to a deal with the UK, which is something worth keeping an eye on. I'd like your thoughts on what explains India's newfound fondness for FTAs. And maybe we'll start with Arun and then turn it over to Judy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. As you know, Atman, the Modi government had originally shown a mistrust of FTAs. They suspended most talks after 2014, scrapped all bilateral investment treaties. And then in 2019, India walked out of the RCEP. Interestingly, while India has refused to reconsider, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have applied to join the RCEP. But as I mentioned, there seems to be a recent change in posture. I would not necessarily consider it or characterize it as a fondness for FTAs. I believe there has been a realization of the benefits of FTAs, especially in an environment where the global supply chain situation is opening opportunities for India. I would think that's probably the most important reason. Second, free trade agreements are not just about tariff reductions or transactional approaches. They are seen as an expression of mutual trust between countries. So as India seeks to enhance its sphere of influence and its circle of trusted partners, I think India is beginning to see FTAs as playing to that interest of India. I think the FTA with UAE and Australia probably partly motivated by India's interest in expanding its sphere of influence. So my thoughts.
Judy?
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, good. It doesn't sound like it up here. I think Arun is right. I don't have this insights like he has into why the government is doing this. But my first thought was I was puzzled because they're establishing of trade barriers to promote local industry seems to fly in the face of joining so many trade agreements that seem to be contradictory. So all I would add is I think Arun is right, and I think that one consideration to keep in mind is that the larger the group of countries, both not necessarily just by count, but by the economic piece of the global pie that they embody, the larger that is, the more likely that you will actually help create benefits through creating trade with your partners. And those will tend to be larger than what would happen if you actually recognize the fact that you also are simultaneously creating losses potentially by diverting trade from other trade partners. So the fact that you have 2 agreements out there that India is not yet part of that are large, I think it would perhaps be important for India to reconsider whether those might be better options for them to join in.
Thanks. So I'm hearing both of you would encourage India to take a closer look at those regional trade arrangements in Asia. Both your presentations focused on India's inward focus, the increased set of tariffs. Arun mentioned last summer this ban on laptops, PCs, tablets that was eventually walked back by the Indian government in favor of an import management system. But there are still concerns in industry that this kind of management system could be the predicate to further import restrictions in the not too distant future. India is going to start its 2-month-long elections. You might have heard. We'll know the outcome in June. But many observers predict the current BJP government will win a parliamentary majority and earn a 3rd term. So let's assume for the moment, let's say that were to happen. What will the new government's likely approach to trade be? Maybe we'll start with Arun.
I think, Atman, we'll see continuity. I think it's going to be more of the same. I think there are a few trade items that have not been concluded, like the UK FTA, an FTA with Oman, EU. I think there will be a focus on getting those done. I also think that there could be a greater focus on the Indo-Pacific economic framework, the loose trade agreements that have to deal with becoming more of a player in the Indo-Pacific. But bottom line, I'd see a lot of continuity. I wouldn't see dramatic changes.
Trade policy continuity. Let's go to the audience now. I see a number of hands up. Maybe we'll start with the gentleman in the green shirt. Yep, that's right, to Ajay's right.
Hi, it's great to hear two advocates of free trade agreements in a context where, from an Indian government perspective especially, their ask ask has been opening up in services access. And all the proponents of trade are correct that increasing trade will improve economic good all around. The big question is that all the countries that want to bring their goods to India don't want Indian services to enter their countries. So this is the crux of the dispute over RCEP and so on. And having lived a little bit in Singapore, I know how well the government there understands its own manufacturing strengths and weaknesses and negotiates the agreements knowing fully well which sectors of their economy can benefit from such an agreement. One of the questions I'd like to pose to you is that the position of the government of India may in part be rooted in their lack of knowledge about their own strengths and weaknesses, and merely saying plus $53 billion doesn't create a ground level incentive for action. You have to drill it down to say, footwear is going to win, clothing is going to win, these guys are going to win, and thereby create the incentive. So I'd like to ask the twin questions of the two participants. What are your views on the expansion of FTAs to include service trade? That's question one. And secondly, what can be done in India to improve their ground level understanding of their own strengths and weaknesses, much like, say, the Singapore government does?
Judy, would you try, would you?
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's rather complicated and take a long answer, but let me see if I can give you some ideas. I think you're right that you alluded to this disagreement in negotiating an RCEP, for example. This is one of the problems with free trade agreements, as opposed to more action in the WTO, the multilaterals, is that you have much more of this sort of infighting over sectors benefiting or losing, so-called. And it becomes really difficult to negotiate something that makes everybody happy. So I think that is a key problem with these kinds of regional agreements. The study I noted here actually goes well into the weeds of where the benefits and costs would come from. So I encourage you to take a look at it. I didn't go that far because it would be too long a presentation. But I think you make a very good point that I'll just allude to this illustration of the restriction on imported laptops and other digital items that was walked back. Who does that? If you stop and think for a moment that those kinds of products are actually inputs for many individuals that augment their skills and augment their productivity in other industries, why would you want to put barriers against imports of those products? it doesn't make sense. Even, I think India cannot be described in any way as an infant industry type of situation. And so there doesn't seem to be any argument to go back in that direction, but particularly for items which actually augment productivity, clearly. So your point that India doesn't really recognize where its strengths are, I think you're right.
So maybe in the interest of time, we'll group the questions. Let's start way back there. If you don't mind standing up, just please introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Yeah, I'm Sanjay Kathuria. Hi, Judith. How are you? I'm currently affiliated with the Center for Social and Economic Progress and the U.S. Institute of Peace. I have some comments. First, on the issue of free trade agreements, I'm much less sanguine about what both of you have spoken about in the context of India's so-called push to free trade agreements, because they are actually rather shallow FTAs, bilateral in nature. They don't go, the fact that we've been negotiating, India's been negotiating with the EU for more than a decade speaks to that, because the moment you get into depth and you get into intellectual property or environmental regulations, that's where the buck stops. India cannot. And then there are also shallowness also in terms of how much India is prepared to give, even in terms of goods trade. Either the agreements are heavily backloaded, or some products are completely taboo. You will not open up, for example, ready-made garments will under no circumstances, or the dairy sector, which was one of the issues in RCEP. They will certainly not open up. So I think India is not going to go to mega agreements, regional agreements. It's going to do bilateral, hopefully increasingly with some greater depth, so that they can truly benefit from FTAs. Otherwise, it's going to be very transactional bilateral FTAs, which is the current UAE, Australia kind of agreements. The second point I want to make is that is the issue of, I think Arun spoke about semiconductors, and India's total budget for subsidies on PLI, include semiconductors. It is a fraction, maybe 1%, 5% of what the US has put on the Inflation Reduction Act. And we've seen, billions of dollars, just Samsung, TSMC, Intel, they are investing. And we're talking of total investments, hundreds of billions of dollars, right? My question is, trade policy is now changing. The character is going into, it's more like the trade wars are morphing into fiscal wars, right? Fiscal capacity, right? India doesn't have that kind of fiscal muscle. And yet we talk of the Quad. So my question really, Arun, perhaps to you, because you move in these kinds of circles, why is there not more coordination in investments in this very, very expensive sector in semiconductors, where obviously all the concepts of friendshoring, etc., are very salient, right? So why doesn't that happen? Say, India is known for design capability in semiconductors. Much of the world's manpower in semiconductors, the design end comes from India. So why isn't there more of that happening? So yeah, so I think I'm kind of less sanguine on the overall India being the next China. There are lots of tailwinds, but yeah, there are also these kind of self-made headwinds as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask all the participants to please keep your comments very short. And just if you have a question, let's please get to it in the interest of time. Over to you, Vikram.
Thank you very much. Vikram Nehru, Johns Hopkins University. First of all, I fully align myself with Sanjay's points that not all free trade agreements are born equal, and they shouldn't be mentioned in the same breath because they really are quite different. I have a very precise, very specific conundrum, which I hope you will try and resolve for me. First of all, despite the fact that China's part of the RCEP, part applied for the CPTPP and so forth, and India has not. India's trade GDP ratio is higher than China's when you include goods and services. And in large part because services exports have increased so rapidly. Just in the previous session, Sajid Chinoy made the very important point that India is rapidly becoming the office of the world. The JP Morgan's 60,000 employees are providing services globally, as I'm sure KPMG is, or did rather, under Arun's chairmanship. How is this possible when India's services trade restrictiveness index is amongst the highest in the world? I think it's in the top 3, if not the highest. In other words, it has the most restrictive regime when it comes to trade in services. And yet, it has become such a powerful exporter of services to the world. How can you help me resolve this simple contradiction? Thank you.
And then one last question back there. Yes, you.
This question is also related to
Yep.
My name is Ijaz Ghani. Simple question. How important is the role of diaspora connection in driving trade? The reason I'm asking, so many Indians here, the entire California, the Google CEO, that diaspora connection took off in services. Why not replicate the same thing in manufacturing sector so that the China-US trade shifts to India-US, get more migrants to work in the manufacturing sector?
Thank you. Maybe, Arun, I'll turn to you with apologies, 90 seconds, and then over to Judy for the last word.
Okay. So very quickly on this question relating to semiconductors. So the Indian government has created an Indian semiconductor mission, which is focused on developing a strategy and directing investments towards building semiconductor capacity. So I believe that it does take a lot of money, but I think they're making some few big bets. One could question the issue of the government picking winners, but that's what they're doing. They're making a few bets and nudging things in a certain way. But maybe that's a good way to accelerate building some kind of a foundation. So they've got Micron and they've got Tata's doing a bunch of things. Apple is well known as manufacturing in India. So I would look at that high-level manufacturing and some parts of semiconductors as being a first step. As was mentioned, the way India will really score is in the design area, and that's an area where I think India will continue to play a big role in semiconductors. Second, coming to the services part that Vikram mentioned, I mean, India has all these restrictions on legal firms coming to the country or CPA firms practicing in the country. So you're right, Vikram, there are a number of restrictions, but those restrictions don't necessarily apply to exports. So I think where India is winning is in exporting the kinds of things that JP Morgan's done and what firms like ours used to does. And that's driven by the talent that India has and the cost structure currently in India. Also, the cost structure will start moving up. So those would be my main responses.
Thanks. Judy,
Okay,
last word.
I'll try to tackle some of the remaining questions that were raised. Sanjay, to your point about trade agreements, I agree with you. I'm a big fan of multilateral negotiations, but so I understand that, as you pointed out, the smaller agreements are likely to be more easily done and deeper. Both of those points are important, but I think the risk of having big costs from trade diversion resulting from multiplicities of small agreements like that, I think is important to consider. So if I had to choose anything, I would choose advocating going towards more multilateral negotiation. But in light of the fact that the WTO seems to still be stalled out on this, hence my consideration of maybe RCEP and CPTPP need a second look. But I think you made a fair point. And Ijaz, to your point, the diaspora, that's kind of interesting because in China's situation, they actually had quite a bit of foreign direct investment flows into the country during this big boom of global supply chain participation, which came from ethnically Chinese sources, such as communities in Singapore or other countries. So if you think of that as a diaspora, if you will, that did play a big role. So to the extent that maybe that kind of a diaspora effect could be available to India is an interesting point, I think.
Thanks, Judy. We'll have to leave it there. How about a nice round of applause for both our speakers?